last time. And I don't recall, those of you who were here, where exactly did we end up? I had asked a question and I wasn't getting any responses back. And I didn't write down where we were exactly. We were talking about stuff in Poland's book. Can somebody remind me where we were?
I think it was right after we looked at Google Earth, but I'm not sure what we went into after that.
So when we looked at Google Earth, what were we looking at?
We were looking at the chicken coops.
Oh yeah, so we were looking at chicken. Oh, we were talking about Rosie. Rosie, the free range organic chicken. So, and I had asked you guys what Poland had to say about Rosie, the free range organic chicken, because he attempted to go to Petaluma Poultry, which is located in California. And when he got there, he basically just managed to get to the headquarters, which wasn't really what he was hoping to do. He was hoping to see the actual place where they grow the chickens. But while he was there, they described the chickens and how they were being housed. And I had asked you guys, what the specifics were of that. And I went and showed you some pictures of these long chicken coops that are pretty much the standard arrangement for chicken coops. They're very, very long, in many cases, 400 feet or longer. They typically have fans at one end that pull air through and a bunch of vents at the other end that allow for there to be a movement of air through these large chicken coops, which have tens of thousands of chickens inside of them, sometimes upwards of 20,000 chickens in one of these houses. And then there are usually little mini grain elevators that basically takes the grain mixture, mixes it, and then ships it out in food troughs that are located inside the chicken coop. And we looked at a couple of those from aerial views. And I had asked you, in what ways does the Petaluma way of raising chickens organically differ from these non-organic chicken operations? And the photos that I had pulled up for you on Google Earth were from chicken operations down in the Ozarks. So what's the difference? According to Poland's description of Petaluma Poultry, describing them to him.
I think he was kind of getting at the point that it's kind of the same, almost like he was expecting, because it was organic, to be like the farm you saw like Joel Salatin have, but it was very much industrialized.
Yeah, he was expecting what he refers to as supermarket pastoral. That you would find these chickens out running around on the landscape, and everything would be happy, and they would be eating grass and insects, et cetera, et cetera. And what was described to him was basically just an industrial kind of farming situation with chickens in these big houses. But it was just done in a way that satisfied USDA organic standards rather than not satisfying USDA organic standards. So fundamentally, how would the Petaluma Poultry way of doing business be different than, say, a Tyson chicken farm? So they weren't terribly different, but they were somewhat different. What are the differences?
Did it say that Rosie gets to live a couple days longer since they're not given hormones?
I don't think there's really any difference in the length of life. Maybe you have to grow them longer in order to get them to a heavier mass. But certainly they're not given growth hormones. And this is one of the requirements of USDA organic standards, is you're not allowed to give your animals things like hormones to get them to grow faster. So certainly that's one difference. What are some other differences?
The chickens get like a grassy yard to run around in.
Yeah, so one of the other differences is that along the side of the house will be a grass run, what you would call at my house, the chicken coop that I have at home has a coop where they go inside at night, where they go in and lay their eggs, and then there's a chicken run on the outside of that is encased in chicken wire, but allows them to go out, get some sun, run around. It's got branches and stuff that they can climb around on. It's got a little swing that I built for them. My chickens are way too pampered, especially considering the amount of eggs that they're currently producing. And so one of the requirements is that the chickens, one of the organic requirements is that chickens have access to the outside. And so along the length of this house will be built a chicken run with little doors that open out onto the chicken run so that the chickens can go out and get some fresh air and some grass and whatnot whenever they want. What's the problem with this at Petaluma Poultry? It sounds nice. According to Poland, how big is that run?
$15 feet.
Is that what it was? I'm trying to look it up. Where is that? Who was that? Was that Kenton?
$172.
172. Thanks for that. Grassy yard. Oh, 15 feet wide. Not nearly big enough to accommodate all 20,000 birds inside should the group ever decide to take air in mass, which truth be told is the last thing the farm managers want to see happen, since these defenseless, crowded, and genetically identical birds are exquisitely vulnerable to infection. So if the growers of these chickens don't want their chickens going outside, how do they do that? How do they manage to keep these animals inside if there are doors that go to the outside?
To keep the food and water inside.
So all the food and water is inside. So at my chicken coop, which I don't know that I have any pictures of my chicken coop, but my chicken coop that I built my chickens, if you look at it from the side, it looks kind of like this, and it's up on stilts. And there's a nest box off to the side. It also has a sloped roof. And if you lift this up, there's a tube here where I can put chicken feed in, and then the chicken feeder goes down to the bottom, and then it has these pipes that allow the food to come out, and there are little holes in the pipe, and the chickens can get at the food there. And then inside the door of the coop, I have little chicken feeders mounted on the door so that when they're inside the house, they can also eat if they don't want to go outside the house, especially when it's cold. So I have inside feeders and outside feeders. I have inside waterers and outside waterers, so that wherever my chickens want to go, they can get whatever they need wherever they're at. In this particular chicken house that Poland is describing, all the food and water is inside. There's no food and water outside. What else do they do to ensure that chickens don't go outside? It's on the same page.
It said they kept the doors shut until they were at least 5 weeks old, so they were already settled into habit by then.
Yeah, so they keep the door shut for 5 weeks. What's the slaughter date for these guys?
7 weeks.
What's that?
7 weeks.
7 weeks. So 5/7 of the life of these chickens, they live indoors, and they live indoors without any access to the outside. The last 2 weeks of their life, they're allowed to go outside, but of course they don't go outside because they've become accustomed to being inside. My chickens we're not raising to eat the chickens. We're raising to get the eggs off of the chickens. But basically, we opened up the chicken coop as soon as we thought that they would be capable of going down the ramp. And so this idea that Rosie, the Petaluma poultry free range organic chicken, is actually free range is kind of a bogus claim, because they're kept inside the coop without the doors being open for a large proportion of their life. And when they finally do open the doors, they have become so acculturated to being indoors that they don't really want to go outdoors anyway. And so they end up spending all of their time inside, because that's also where all the food and water is. And so this satisfies the raising requirements that are required of the organic labeling regulations, but it doesn't really produce a free range chicken in the same way that Joel Salatin's chickens are free range. How does this compare to what Joel Salatin does with his chickens? Somebody else? We've described how Joel Salatin's chickens are raised. Just repeat it for me. Remind us.
His is the one where they're like in the field eating the bugs and everything, correct?
Yeah, they're in a field. They have a mobile chicken coop, and then they surround a grassy area around that chicken coop with electrical wire. And every couple of days or so, they move that coop so that they're on new fresh grass and new fresh cow pats. And they just rotate, they just move these chicken coops through the field over the course of the year. And so they are they're spending much more of their time outside. They're spending much more of their time eating grass and insects and things like this than any sort of industrial operation where you're basically feeding them grain and keeping them indoors the whole time. And so what's called free range is very different depending upon, who's doing the growing and the specifics of how the animals are raised. So I guess my next set of questions is, so did you guys go and look at the Agricultural Marketing Service website and look at the organic standards? How did these standards come into place? And Poland talks about this at some length in the book. Who's Gene Kahn? Who's Gene Kahn?
Is he the founder of Cascadian Farms?
Yeah, so he's founder of Cascadia Farms. What else is notable about him, according to Poland?
Did he sell the farm to General Mills?
Eventually, yeah. I was thinking of something else, though.
He's the guy that had the theories for improving the farming market.
Yeah, so he's interested in transforming kind of the marketing of food, especially organic food, because he started an organic farm back in the early 70s and built that farm into a success. But in the early 70s, there was no such thing as an organic certification process. What happened in the early 90s that Kahn was involved in? And of course, this happened.
Big organic and little organic.
Well, okay, so Kahn would definitely be in the big organic camp, large industrial-sized farms, but that are growing using organic principles, and we'll talk about what those organic principles are. But what happened in the mid '90s that made the government begin to take labeling things differently than they did before the mid '90s?
The more farmers started selling organic goods.
So more farmers started selling organic goods, but what especially happened in 1996 that kind of changed the food landscape? This is not in this chapter, but we've talked about this at some length. There was a graph on the last exam, and there was a vertical dotted line at the year 1996 on the graph.
The introduction of GE.
Yeah, the introduction of genetically engineered crops. And so in the early 90s, more and more farmers were moving to organic farming. There was a lot of variation in what people were calling organic. And then with the onset of genetically engineered foods in the mid 90s, and they were being developed prior to that, there became a movement to kind of standardize what it meant to be an organic farmer. And when genetically engineered crops came on the market, then there was definitely a need, because one of the things that organic farmers did not want to be lumped into is farmers that were using genetically engineered crops. So Gene Kahn, because he was the owner of Cascadia Farms at the time, he was asked to serve on what governmental board? On page 155.
USDA.
Yeah, but what's that, Branson?
National Organic Standards.
Yeah, he was put in 1992 on the National Organic Standards Board. And in 1990, there had been a law passed that basically governed what could be labeled organic and not. And one of the things of that legislation was that you couldn't use any sort of synthetic products in the growing of organic food. And his argument was that if you prevented the use of synthetically generated compounds in growing organic, then you would basically put an end to the organic food industry. And so a guy who was the owner of one of the largest organic operations present in the United States at the time, if not the largest one, is put on the organic standards board. And what's the difficulty with putting a large organic farmer on the organic standards board?
Bias?
Oh, explain yourself. Who was that, Olivia?
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you mean?
So basically, the issue is that he obviously has this large operation, so his advocacy could be in the hopes of saving his own operations versus having a broader picture of all the other topics up for discussion.
Yeah, so to put it in an agricultural analogy or metaphor or whatever, it's like putting the fox in charge of a hen house. And so this is a common difficulty that people in government have. Have you guys ever looked at the House Committee on Science, Technology, and Space? Anybody? I'm guessing the answer is no.
Yeah, I haven't.
You haven't. You haven't, Marcus? You just don't do this stuff in your spare time? I just don't understand. Give me a minute to go and dig something up. In the House of Representatives, there's a committee that basically is in charge of crafting and reviewing legislation that has to do with science, technology, and space, and it's called the Science, Technology, and Space Committee, and it's made up of members of Congress. And so it is interesting when you look at Congress. Let me do a search here real quick. I'm going to share my screen with you for a few minutes. So I was interested in this a couple of years ago, and I went online and basically, it was quite a few years ago, November 2014, I wrote a blog post about this, and in the process of doing this, I actually made a graph of the background of everybody on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee in the U.S. House, and this was in 2014, but I can't imagine that things have appreciably changed very much because both of the physics PhDs who were in the House of Representatives at the time have since retired from public service in the House, and so we're actually down to scientists. And what you see represented, can you guys see this bar chart? Yeah, okay. What you see is the number of individuals that are on this committee who are in law, business, medicine, education, finance, military, politics. And by politics, I just classified those people as people who have never really had a job outside of politics once they graduated from college, engineering, journalism, and nursing. So if you include nursing and engineering and medicine in the general category of science, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 individuals on this committee who actually have any sort of significant scientific background. How many people are there total? 15. And 11 is 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. 40 members of this committee, and 5 of them have nominally scientific backgrounds. This is the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. What's the difficulty here?
You can't have a lot of informed opinions.
You can't have a lot of informed opinions. The 15 lawyers that are on that committee don't have any idea what science is or how science works, probably. I doubt that the 11 business people who are on there have much of an idea of how science works. Medical doctors, we used to have a professor here who did not consider students who were going into medicine as being scientists, because they ended up practicing medicine rather than practicing a pure form of science. I disagreed with him. I think medical students and doctors actually have a lot of the characteristics of scientists, and so we disagreed on that particular front. But yeah, it's tricky. So when you don't know about something, but you're in charge of something, what do you have to do?
Deliberate to kind of the information that you can access.
Yeah, so, but where are you going to get that information? Somebody other than Blair. You guys ever watch C-SPAN? Oh my gosh, you don't, Mackenzie? Yeah, you guys need broader, more exciting lives. You can sit on C-SPAN for hours and hours and watch one guy speak in front of an empty room at Congress. That's kind of what C-SPAN is all the time. But occasionally, C-SPAN covers committee hearings, committees like the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And at these committee meetings is actually where a lot of stuff gets done in Congress, not actually on the floor of the House and the Senate, but actually done in committee rooms. And what they will often do in committee rooms is the Congress people who are on the committee will bring in expert witnesses to testify about certain things. And so if they want to know something about space, they'll call in physicists, they'll call in people from NASA, and they will come and they'll give information to the committee in the hopes of informing the committee about whatever it is that the committee needs informed about, that those people have expertise on. And so when you don't know about something, what you do is you go and you seek out subject matter experts who hopefully know what they're talking about, and get advice and consult with those people, because they have knowledge that you yourself do not have. And this is why people like Gene Kahn end up getting appointed to things like the National Organic Standards Board, is because they're perceived as subject matter experts on organic farming, in this case, because the dude runs an organic farm. And so it's understandable why Congress would turn to people like Gene Kahn to serve on one of these boards. But of course, what's the tricky part about doing all of this? Olivia, you were pointing at it earlier.
I think the tricky part is like being able to define like who exactly you should have like on a committee is like kind of the issue.
Yeah, so the trick is that whoever you choose, they're going to bring whatever biases they have to the table. And in the case, if you're the largest organic producer in the United States, the Organic Standards Board, whatever regulations they recommend to Congress and that ultimately get accepted, those are going to be things that basically are things that large organic producers want to have in there. Small organic producers are going to largely be left out, simply because they weren't ever invited to the table for the discussion. And this is the problem with everything in Congress. The information Congress gets, I mean, there are all sorts of things wrong with Congress. the information that congressional leaders get is filtered through who they know about and who they invite to inform them. Let me repeat that. The information that they get is filtered through who they are aware of and who they invite ultimately to come and inform them. They are not doing what a scientist would do, which is basically sit around for months reading a buttload of scientific literature, trying to figure out what the scientific consensus on something is, and then basing their decisions on that. They're going to invite 4 people, 5 people to a set of hearings. They're going to take what those 4 or 5 people say as what the scientific consensus is, whether or not that is actually the scientific consensus. And then they're going to proceed as if the information that they have gotten is the best possible information that there could be out there. This will happen on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. It will happen on committees dealing with intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. Now, one of the nice things about the intelligence committees is that the people that they communicate with primarily are people who are employed by the government in the intelligence agencies. So presumably those are people who are relatively good at what they do. But there's throughout this whole process, there is a strong possibility of bias. So I think I ran the numbers here. Yeah, only 6.4% of this committee is actually people with a background in science. And so our best advice that we're getting to Congress is coming from experts that may or may not be biased, and it's being processed by a bunch of people who don't have the knowledge base to determine whether or not the people who are testifying in front of them are actually giving them a fair and balanced view of the world. And so when you put a large organic farmer in charge of setting up the standards for what satisfies the requirements for being called organic, then you can guess that it's going to include all of the things that that particular farmer happens to be doing at that particular moment. Because if I was an organic farmer, that's what I would do. I'm sure if you were an organic farmer, you would do the same if you got called to Congress to serve in this capacity. How do you guys feel about government right now?
I mean, about the same, but
Okay, about the same, but
that's not very high to begin with.
okay, so I haven't moved the needle much. Maybe your pessimism about government is maybe just a little more informed.
More like a sounds about right.
More like it sounds about right. Okay. What about the rest of you?
I'm kind of with Blair. It just never changes for me.
Okay. What about the rest of you? Mary is smirking. I can maybe read what is on her mind by her facial expression.
I mean, yeah, I think I agree with the fact that, I mean, that's kind of what I expected.
Okay, so I'm not revealing any great truths to you. Jackson, how about you?
I feel about the same as everybody else, really.
Man, you guys are a really pessimistic generation. Mackenzie.
I mean, like only because like that's something probably in our lifetime that will not change.
And yeah, I've
Cool.
definitely multiple occasions of people in government trying to get up and talk about something that they don't have knowledge in, and you can just like tell, like knowing that now, it's like that makes sense where that comes from.
Facts.
Okay. Jackson. Oh, so I checked in with Jackson Branson.
I'm sorry, I'm completely lost on what the question.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I missed what you were asking.
Oh, how do you feel about government after this little discussion?
I mean, basically like everybody else, it's
Okay. Blake?
Same as everybody else.
Same as everybody else. Okay. Winston and Kenton.
How do I feel about government?
Yeah, based on this conversation that we just had, does that change your view of government? Does it stay the same or?
Oh, no, I probably still conceive of government as a genocidal entity that, like, ultimately is only interested in propagating its own power.
Okay. All right. So it hasn't changed your opinion at all either. I remember you saying that in an earlier class. Always refreshing. Winston.
No, I think the government's just kind of like sneaky and fishy, so it didn't really surprise me at all.
Okay. Well, you guys, man, that's just depressing. You're the future, and this is how you view your government?
I mean,
So what do you think about government?
to be fair, though, even if we are the future, the government that's being run right now isn't being run by us.
That's true. That's very true. It's being run by a bunch of old white guys for the most part. If you look at the demographics of the House and Senate and the current presidency and the future presidency, and that does not really reflect you guys at all, does it?
No.
No.
What's Dr. Clancy? So what do you think about the government?
Well, I try not to inject myself into class too much because I don't want you to think that you need to respond to questions that I have in any way that in order to just, I'm going to answer this way because I want to placate Dr. Klawinski because I don't want to piss him off and he'll give me a bad grade on my GMO report that's due after Thanksgiving. So I try not to tell you how I feel unless I really think that you need to know. So for example, at the beginning of class, when we were talking about coal employment and things like this, I told you I'm not a big fan of Trump. But when we look at the coal issue, when we look at it quantitatively, the coal issue, the soybean issue, the soybean farmers were upset at Trump because Trump started a trade war with China, and that led to a decrease in the price of soybeans that soybean farmers were getting. And they weren't very happy about that. But then when you start to look at the numbers, the decline in soybean prices was actually pretty minor compared to the fluctuations of soybean prices that have gone on for the last 20 years or so. And so at the end of the day, I couldn't really side with the farmers very well because quite frankly, Trump's trade war didn't really depress soybean prices very much if you consider something more than like a 4 or 5 month span. During that 4 or 5 month span, they did decline quite a lot, but they've declined much, much greater in the past, and they've increased much greater in the past. So I'm the last person to want to apologize for Trump, but I thought that the farmers were giving Trump kind of a raw deal, simply because they've suffered much, much worse declines in soybean prices for other reasons in the past. So not a Trump apologist, but on this particular issue, I don't think the farmers have a lot to complain about with regards to Trump. I clearly think that government is fundamentally flawed when you have a bunch of non-scientists making decisions about science. What's my issue with the Science, Space, and Technology Committee is that it doesn't have scientists on that committee. Well, why does it not have scientists on that committee? Well, because there are very few scientists in Congress. Look across all of the Senate and all of the House, there just aren't very many people who are in science in government, in elected government. Well, why is that the case?
Because they're often doing science.
Well, we're off doing science. What else prevents somebody like me, who obviously thinks about politics and science, what prevents somebody like me from running for office?
I mean, the fact that you'd have to get elected.
Oh, I would have to get elected, and I'm about the least electable person you can think of. I'm an old white guy. I shave my head mainly because I shaved my head in defiance when I got my PhD. The morning of graduation, I shaved my head as kind of my outward expression of throwing off the mantle of academia, such that they don't have any control over me any longer. And I've kept my head shaved ever since. It was stupid, childish behavior, but turns out I have a not bad looking head from the shape of it, and I just kept it. When I worked in Peru for 3 months and I couldn't take a shower in some case for multiple days at a time, it just became easier to groom, also not having hair that you had to wash, et cetera, et cetera. But if I was running for election, people could paint me as a skinhead because I'm a skinhead, not a like neo-Nazi fascist skinhead, but I do have a bald head, and I'm fairly outspoken. I don't mince words typically, and when students come to class and they haven't read the reading, I actually just shut off the Zoom meeting early because it's a waste of our time to sit there in silence, which is what I did on Wednesday for those of you who weren't here. So yes, I'm probably unelectable. What are other barriers for getting somebody like me elected?
The truth?
Yeah. Give it to me, Marcus.
Oh, that was my answer. The truth. Like, you know too much of the truth. Like, I feel like people in government kind of shy from the truth a lot of the times.
Well, okay, so if I was in Congress, certainly one committee I would be angling to get on is the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, because I think it would be good to have a scientist there.
In regards to the responsibilities of Congress, that would be kind of the only one that you would be geared towards?
It's not the only one that I would be geared towards, but it would certainly be one that I would definitely want to be. I quite frankly think every scientist in Congress should be on that committee. However many there are, they should just be, oh, you have a PhD in a science field? You're on this committee. It just should be required service for you to be on that committee if you're in Congress and you have a PhD in some science field. That's actually not how committees get assigned. Committee memberships get assigned in Congress, as it turns out. What are other barriers to being in our nation's legislative bodies that would keep somebody like me out?
Campaign supporters.
Oh my gosh, so I don't know anybody. I know fewer people now than I did a year ago because I've spent basically the last year in my office. How much do I make? I think I told you guys this earlier in the semester.
61,000.
A little over $60,000. I've been teaching at Williamsville College. This is halfway through my 21st year. What do I not have that most people who run for Congress have?
Money.
I do not have deep pockets. I do not have the luxury of taking off a year or a year and a half to campaign constantly, which is what one has to do. Think about it. If you're in the House of Representatives, essentially the day you get elected, you start running for re-election again, because every 2 years you have to go up in front of the voters and get re-elected. It seems to me like an incredible grind if you're in the House of Representatives, just the constant, you're constantly, while you're trying to do your job, which is to hopefully pass legislation to make life better for Americans, you're constantly having to be cognizant in the back of your mind that, oh, in 24 months, I have to be reelected again. It seems like a terrible job. But it's also a job that in order to get there, you kind of have to be financially well off enough that you can take a year and a half off of your normal job to go and do the process of getting elected to Congress, which is a high bar. And that's maybe the worst of the whole thing, is that the reason that we have a bunch of old white men primarily in the House of Representatives and the Senate is because those are the people who are wealthy enough and connected enough to pull off getting elected in the first place. So it shouldn't surprise us that they also have jobs like being lawyers, which are very high paying jobs because lawyers have enough money laying around that they can take the time off to invest in getting elected. And it also that makes sense that people who are in charge of writing laws would be people who know the law. That's certainly part of it as well. So I guess, Marcus, in answer to your question, it seems to me that the government should serve its citizens better than our current government does. It should probably represent, in terms of its composition, it should represent the demographic of the people that it serves better than our current government does. And I guess I have a little bit of a libertarian bent to me. I think that it should be in the business of preserving freedoms rather than taking freedoms away. And once again, I think the government could probably do a better job on that front as well. So I hope that it does improve in your lifetime. And I don't want our conversation about the Science, Space, and Technology Committee to make you even more pessimistic about the prospects for change, because let's face it, you guys are going to be the ones that change it. Boomers are dying. They will eventually die. It's just a fact of life. Everybody dies. The older you get, the more likely you are to die. Keep not wearing masks. We're all more likely to die. Eventually, you will no longer be in the minority. You will become the majority simply because the generations that are going through life before you won't be there any longer. And from now until that point, it's up to you guys to try and make the government a government that you would be proud of and that you think works for you. What you can't do is you can't not go to the polls because government isn't working for you. So that's, I guess, another one of my views towards government, Marcus, is that we let government get away with shit that government gets away with because we're not as involved in government as we could be. And I share as much culpability in that as anyone else. I have never run for public office, although I think it would be fun to do sometime. But then again, I would just be another old white guy in government, which is not necessarily what we need. So people like Gene Kahn were responsible for putting in the organic standards that are currently on the books. And they get looked at periodically and tweaked and updated and things like this. But ultimately, when you see a label on a product in a supermarket and it says that this thing is organic, what it means is that this product satisfies the Organic Standards Board certification process. And that's what I went and asked you to go to the USDA's website and look at. So let's look at these things. Can you guys see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, good. All right. So I've gone to the trouble of kind of distilling down what is in the organic standards. And so every time I pull up a slideshow that I haven't looked at on Zoom, I have to set it up so that it doesn't mess up my ability to see things. All right. So the first thing I want you to recognize and understand is that the organic label is a label. So this is, strangely enough, run by the Agricultural Marketing Service. And so the Agricultural Marketing Service, if you go on their website and look at their mission is to work on advertising and opening markets to American goods, both domestic markets and foreign markets to goods. And so they're involved in marketing, and part of that marketing is what can appear on a label. And so the first thing that I want you to understand is that when you see that something is organic, all it means is that it is able to have that label because the federal government has told them that they could have that label. And in order to have that label, they have to meet certain criteria. And those criteria fall into different categories. One criterion has to do with kind of how you raise plants. The other criterion has to do with how you raise animals. And the other set of criteria has to do with how you handle those products after they've been harvested. And so the harvesting and harvesting and processing process. So in order to label your product organic, you have to do certain things with plants. So you have to not use prohibited substances. And so you can go onto the AMS's website and you can get a list of the prohibited substances. And it includes things like herbicides, and it includes things like pesticides. It also includes things like synthetic fertilizers. You're not allowed to have synthetic fertilizers. You can use things like manure and things like that to fertilize your crop, but you can't use typical synthetic fertilizers that other non-organic operations will use. Soil fertility and crop nutrients will be managed through tillage and cultivation practices, crop rotation, covered crops, supplemented with animal and crop waste materials, and certain allowed synthetic materials. So that was one of Gene Kahn's issues, was that it originally banned all synthetic materials, and there are some synthetic materials that are currently allowed. Pests, weeds, and disease will be controlled primarily through management practices, including physical, mechanical, and biological controls. When these practices are not sufficient, a biological, botanical, or synthetic substance approved for use on the national list may be used. And so if there is a crop pest that cannot be managed through things like tillage and stuff like that, then you are allowed to use, for example, pesticides that are on a list of approved things. Now, some of these approved substances are things that contain biologically generated toxins. So, for example, a toxin that is used by a plant to get rid of herbivores might be allowed to be spread upon a crop because it's actually a natural substance rather than a synthetic substance. Even though the substance might have been generated in a lab, it is a naturally occurring substance that is used by other plants in order to reduce herbivory. So these are the things that are required for a plant crop to be certified. You can't have used a prohibited substance in the last 3 years before you harvest your current organic crop. Things about how you manage the crop from the standpoint of fertility and nutrients, and then how you manage the crop from the standpoint of pest control. Now, one of the things about this is if you can't spread an herbicide on your crop to get rid of weeds, how are you going to get rid of weeds in your fields? And the other thing is there's no genetically engineered crops in any of this. So genetically engineered crops are also out of this whole thing. How do you get rid of weeds if you're not going to use a herbicide?
Equipment.
Sorry, what was that, Mackenzie? You're breaking up.
Hold on.
Say again.
Hello.
Yeah, tell us.
My phone's not working. Equipment.
Okay. Yeah, you would use equipment. You would run a plow down the rows of crops, and it would dig up the spaces between the crop plants, and it would uproot any weeds that were growing between the rows. And one of the consequences of repeatedly plowing your field is that it basically causes your soil to dry out faster because you're constantly upending the soil, and so you have to irrigate more. It also leads to more erosion of topsoil from things like water and wind because you're once again constantly bringing that soil to the surface. And also, because you're running a tractor through your field periodically, it can have the effect of compressing the soil in certain places, which makes it harder for plants to grow. And so even though you are growing your crop organically, there are plenty of negative consequences that happen from those organic processes because of increases in water loss from the soil, erosion, etc. And so there are some people who argue that actually organic farming, while it might be better in some ways, is actually worse ways of farming in other ways because of things like erosion and degradation of the quality of the land that organic farming is done on. Oftentimes, to get rid of weeds instead of plowing, they will actually employ human beings to go in and hand pull weeds. That ends up being much more cost prohibitive because you have to pay those people, which is one of the reasons that organic products are more expensive generally in the supermarket, is it requires more labor and more investment in order to grow those crops satisfying these standards. For livestock, they have to be raised under organic management from the last third of gestation or no later than the second day of life for poultry. So for livestock to be organic, they have to adhere to organic standards a certain amount of time into gestation or the second day of life if you're poultry. Producers must feed livestock that are 100% organic, but they may also provide allowed vitamin and mineral supplements. And so one of the things that makes organic meat organic is the food that you feed the cows and chickens and pigs and whatnot. And so they have to be raised on 100% organic feed, which means that the feedstocks that you feed them have to adhere to all of these plant crop regulations. That obviously is going to make the feed more expensive, which is then going to make the meat more expensive. But once again, you're not feeding these livestock anything different than you would feed your livestock in a commercial non-organic feedlot. It's just that the corn and soybeans that you feed these animals are organically grown corn and soybeans. You're not necessarily grazing these individuals on pasture. Dairy animals must be managed organically for at least 12 months in order for milk or dairy products to be sold, labeled, or represented as organic. Preventive management practices must be used to keep animals healthy. Producers may not withhold treatment from sick or injured animals. However, you can't treat them with prohibited substances. So if there is something wrong with your animal, you have to treat it, but if you have to treat it with a prohibited substance, then it can no longer be sold as organic because it has one of those prohibited substances in it. One of those prohibited substances is, of course, growth hormone. So you have to manage your animals without antibiotics, without growth hormones, without mammalian or avian byproducts. You can't grind up the unused portions of cows, mix that into the feed and feed that to your cows. So there are all sorts of things that you can't do. So if you buy an organic chicken at the supermarket, you can assume that it is antibiotic free and growth hormone free because it has gone through this certification process. Ruminants must be out on pasture for the entire grazing season, but for not less than 120 days. These animals must also receive at least 30% of their feed or dry matter intake from pasture. So once again, digging into the details of this, outside of the grazing season, ruminants must have free access to the outdoors, but they probably aren't going to be grazing in fields, but the feed that they're getting inside of their barns has to be at least 30% from like hay that has been harvested from pastures and things like this. And once again, all of that stuff has to be grown organically, but quite frankly, all that stuff is going to be grown organically because who puts herbicide and pesticide on a pasture? Nobody really does that. So all organic livestock and poultry are required to have access to the outdoors year-round. Animals may only be temporarily confined to documented environmental or health considerations. So there are requirements for livestock in terms of what you feed them and how much of that is based on pasture and things like managing their access to the outside. Notice that it says livestock and poultry are required to have access to the outdoors year-round. It doesn't say that you force them out into the outdoors. All it says is that you have the door to the barn open. And this is why Petaluma Poultry gets away with putting their chickens in a chicken coop, giving them a run that is not large enough to contain all of the chickens if they all decided to go outside at one time. But they open the doors, and so they can say legitimately that the chickens do have access to the outdoors. It doesn't really matter, according to the standards, if they actually ever go outdoors, as long as they have access to the outdoors. And Poland makes the point, why would you go outdoors anyway? Outdoors is a scary place if all you've ever known is the inside of a chicken coop. I already mentioned to you, we feed our chickens at my house table scraps, and every time you bring a new table scrap that they're unfamiliar with, the most recent thing was the pumpkins left over from Halloween. We brought them nice pumpkin rinds with plenty of pumpkin for them to eat. We set them on the ground. The first thing that they did is they ran underneath the chicken coop because they're afraid of the pumpkins. Then one of them kind of tentatively comes out, pecks at it for a few minutes, and is like, oh, that's pretty good, actually, and starts eating it. And then all the rest of them eventually will come out and do it. Chickens are chickens. They're afraid of the outdoors, even ones that have spent plenty of time in the outdoors, because there's all this new stuff out there. So simply having access doesn't necessarily mean that an animal will take advantage of that access, unless it's been conditioned to take advantage of that access. So then there's a whole ton of handling standards. So while handling, you can't use any of these prohibited substances on the national list of allowed and prohibited substances. Multi-ingredient products labeled as organic must be organically produced unless the ingredient is not commercially available in organic form. Handlers must prevent the commingling of organic with non-organic products and protect organic products from contact with prohibited substances. If it's sold as organic, it has to have at least 95% certified organic content. Products sold labeled as made with organic must have at least 70% content, and products containing less than 70% organic content may identify specific ingredients in there as organic in the ingredients list, but you can't label the whole product as having organic content in it. So this is basically about labeling. Now, we got into this discussion because of Rosie, the free range organic chicken. Did you guys look for the term free range on the U.S. Department of Agriculture's website? Okay. Homework for Monday after Thanksgiving. Go on to the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service website and look for the term free range, grass-fed, pasture-fed or pasture-raised, antibiotic-free, and GMO-free. And be ready to come to class on Monday after Thanksgiving telling me what you found about these terms and whether or not these are approved labels that you can put on food that are certified by the Agricultural Marketing Service. The other thing that I want you to read over Thanksgiving is I want you to go back and read a section from the earlier readings. Well, I'll just send you an email. There are a couple of things that I want you to read from Poland's book. One of the chapters is a chapter on the ethics of eating meat, and the other thing has to do with some earlier stuff that was about slaughtering animals and things like this. So I'll give you some pages to read in Poland, but I'll just send those out in an email. All right. Any questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
Do we have a food journal due today?
No, we don't. I'm going to post new food blogging prompts. They're focused on Thanksgiving, actually. It also has a reading requirement that you need to look at. I'm going to have you read a history professor's account of the first Thanksgiving, and I'm going to ask you to compare that to what your kind of vision of Thanksgiving is that you received during your public school education. And also, I'm going to ask you things about your own Thanksgiving experience in previous years. And it's going to be especially illuminating this year when basically we just canceled Thanksgiving with my girlfriend's family. They're not very happy with it, but we're not going to go and make our bubble any bigger than it absolutely has to be, given that we're kind of at exponential rates of increase of COVID in the Kansas City area. So enjoy your families. Don't enjoy people who are not in your family, please. And stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you on Monday after Thanksgiving, November 30th.
Hey, is the food zone, is that going to be in an email that you're going to send to?
I'll post the instructions on Moodle, but I'll put it in the email that it's up and running when I get it loaded up.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right. See you guys.
Is our paper due the 2nd, not the 9th? Because I think we switched it, but because I think you had the break messed up, so it's the Wednesday after Thanksgiving break.
It's the Wednesday after Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Because I looked on the paper and it still said the 9th, so I didn't know if.
Oh, yeah. My bad. I thought I had changed that, but maybe I didn't. But I need to do that. So let me go and look real quick. Yeah, it should be the 9th.
Okay. All right.